overview. And I will say, with some of the weather this morning, we do have some of our members who will be with us on WebEx.
Good morning, committee. Thank you, Madam Chair. Senate Bill 91 establishes requirements for 191. Yes, sorry. Sometimes I speak too quickly. My apologies. If you ever need me to slow down, just tell me and I will, or I'll try. Senate Bill 191 establishes requirements for the involuntary transfer of a resident in an adult residential care facility, the right to appeal such discharge or transfer, and a process for such appeal. And to give you a background on this law, the Nursing Home Reform Law of 1987 protects residents of nursing homes, which we call in our state adult care homes, from involuntary transfers, but it does not include all facilities, and this bill would expand it to those facilities which are defined in the bill. Section 1 provides that an administrator of an adult residential care facility is not allowed to involuntarily transfer or discharge a resident unless that transfer or discharge is necessary for the resident's welfare and the resident's needs cannot be met by their current facility, the health or safety of others are endangered, the resident has failed after reasonable and appropriate notice to pay, or the facility ceases to operate. The administrator shall provide a written notice for the transfer or discharge at least 30 days ahead of time, unless the resident is in danger or others or has an urgent medical need. And the administrator would be required to develop a discharge plan before the discharge. If a resident receives a notice that's in violation of the rights in Section 1, the resident or the representative would be allowed to appeal that involuntary transfer or discharge to the Secretary of KDADS and file such appeal with the Office of Administrative Hearings. The hearing would be required to be held within 30 days after notice, and when that resident files an appeal, the resident shall remain or be permitted to stay at that facility while during the pendency of that appeal. Section 2 requires that the Secretary for Aging and Disability Services make a form, a 30-day involuntary transfer or discharge notice form. The facilities are not required to use that form, but it must include certain items, including the reason, evidence supporting the reason for that transfer or discharge, contact information, effective date, and so on. The notice should include the name, or shall include the name and contact information of the resident and the person appealing that transfer or discharge, the facility, date and notice of the transfer or discharge, and whether the person appealing would like an informal hearing. Section 3, which requires an administrator before issuing notice of the transfer or discharge to notify the resident, to hold a meeting to discuss and resolve or possibly resolve the reason for the transfer or discharge, and notify the resident that others may join the meeting. Section 4 requires the administrator of that facility to deliver the notice of transfer or discharge to the resident in person, in addition to the resident's representative, the state long-term care ombudsman, and place that in the resident's record. Section 5 allows for an administrative hearing when a resident receives notice that is not the result of a facility having its license revoked or not renewed by the Secretary. The resident or their representative may appeal within 15 days of receiving the date of notice. And if a resident is incapacitated and does not have a representative, the long-term care ombudsman would be allowed to file that appeal. Within 15 days of the receipt of the notice, the office shall hold a hearing, and then within 10 days of the hearing, the office shall issue a decision. Section 6 outlines the process for the informal hearing, and if a resolution is achieved at that informal hearing, no administrative hearing is required. Section 7 requires an administrator to provide notice of an emergency transfer or discharge prior to or within 48 hours of such transfer or discharge. The KDAD secretary would decide what constitutes an emergency, and if that transfer or discharge is considered an emergency, then the provisions of Section 8 through 10 would apply to that notice and process of such transfer or discharge. Section 8 requires the secretary to make available a form for an emergency transfer or discharge, and that administrator shall provide an emergency transfer or discharge notice that includes a statement of the right to appeal, the procedure, and a copy of that notice form. Section 9 requires before an emergency or transfer discharge notice is provided that it be reviewed and approved by the Secretary as an emergency, and Section 10 grants residents the right to appeal an emergency transfer or discharge and gives some of the administrative language there. And I did not state it specifically in the brief, but the definition for the adult residential care facility provided in the bill, now that I got them all mixed up, would include an assisted living facility, a residential care facility, home plus, or a boarding care home, as such terms are defined in the adult care home statutes. And I'll be happy to answer questions.
Committee, do we have any quick questions for Jenna? Seeing none, we'll move to our proponents. Thank you, Jenna. Thorough as usual. You will have 2 minutes for each of our proponents, and we will begin with the in-person, which would be Camille Russell.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. I am Camille Russell, the Kansas State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, and I'm here as a proponent to Senate Bill 191. Thank you very much for the opportunity to do this. The State Long-Term Care Ombudsman are advocates for individuals in nursing homes and the facilities we're talking about today. We get discharge notices for the nursing homes. We do not get the discharge notices by law for the involuntary discharge notices for the homes we're speaking about today, and they don't have appeal rights, which they do in the actual nursing homes. This is really important. This is a huge complaint. It's been one that's huge with our program for years, and we're not really asking these homes to do anything that they're not already supposed to do with regard to when they do a discharge or how they do the discharge notices. This is nothing new. The new thing is that we're going to be able to look at those notices as well as the federal notices to see that they are complete, help them understand how they can contact ks.gov to file a complaint, how they can file an appeal. They have no appeal rights at this point, and they should have those appeal rights in due process. We're not asking the homes to do anything that they're not already supposed to be doing, but what we know as the Ombudsman program is that we will find that they don't always provide all of the information they're supposed to. They don't always provide the evidence for why they say they are discharging these individuals. And they have a path to do that they're just not following. So we're just really asking for a little bit more, and we're asking for a little more oversight and help, honestly, with KDADs in making sure that the businesses that chose this business are just doing it the way that they said they would do it, and that they're following the agreements they made with the people that they made agreements with in those negotiated agreements and following that process. So I have nearly nothing further to say at this time unless I would be able to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you so much for keeping your testimony short. We appreciate it. And next we have Alexandra English. Alexandra, welcome to committee.
Thank you. I want to thank the committee for allowing me to be here today. My name is Alexandra English. I'm the managing attorney of the Kansas City Office of Kansas Legal Services. I'm also our statewide director of the Elder Rights Project, so I work with seniors who are victims of elder abuse. I've spent my 14-year career dedicated to assisting senior citizens, so this is a very important topic to me. I was one who participated on the Judicial Council Advisory Committee that created the language that you're looking at today. We were asked to answer the question, if Kansas creates an appeal process for involuntary discharge of residents from an assisted living facility, residential health care, homes plus facilities, what should those procedures be for that appeal process? We weren't asked to say, yes, we should have one, or no, we shouldn't. That's for you to determine. So we worked with proponents and opponents of this situation, and we received a list that had all of the state's laws compiled together so we could see what other states did. We kind of cherry-picked what we thought would work best for the state of Kansas. We spent hours and hours and hours working together to refine this language. Ultimately, the majority of the committee determined that the language used was the best, most comprehensive plan that balanced the rights of residents to appeal involuntary discharges, while also giving the facilities the ability to keep residents safe and to preserve their business interests. Really quickly, I would like to put on my attorney hat now, and I would like to say that first of all, in reviewing all of those other states' laws, Kansas is one of just barely even a handful of states that has zero appeal process for assisted living facility residents. And when you consider the fact that these people, there are about 10,000 residents in nursing facilities now, maybe even more in the state, and they have been moved out of their homes They deserve dignity that others do for an appeal process.
Thank you so much. And next, we will have on WebEx, the last four on WebEx, this would be Jamie Gideon with the Alzheimer's Association. Jamie, is he available, Dusty? She? She. Thank you,
Good
Jamie.
morning.
Welcome to committee. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Good morning, Madam Chair Gossage, and members of the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. My name is Jamie Gideon. I'm the Kansas Director of Public Policy for the Alzheimer's Association. I wanted to go over what involuntary discharge can, how they can harm people with dementia. It can cause what's called transfer trauma, and people with dementia are particularly vulnerable to transfer trauma. It can lead to a decline in their physical and emotional well-being, and it can lead to a significant health complications and even premature death, which is unfortunately what happened to Mr. Charlie Imthorn. It can also trigger depression, psychological distress, and withdrawal from social activities. I ask that you support this bill because it will enhance the quality of care in residential settings and protect persons with dementia. Thank you, committee. I'll take questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much. And next on WebEx, we would have Judy Davis Cole. Is Judy with us, Dusty? Judy?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can. You have 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Judy Davis Cole. I'm on the Executive Council for Kansas AARP and thus represent about 278,000 AARP members in Kansas. We are a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization that advocates for people above the age of 50. You're aware of the bill and the positive aspects of this bill. I believe, and as a matter of fact, when I talk to people about this bill out in the community, they're very surprised to find out that in these situations of involuntary discharges that there is not an appeal process already in place. The loved ones of these patients find it maddening and frustrating in these situations, and I can't imagine how frightened and confusing the residents must be. Senate Bill 191 will provide requirements for the legal right to appeal. It ensures that the loved ones actually know that there is an appeal process available, and it guides them through the process. It outlines timeframes for this process. It involves the resident, the providers, the doctors, the caregivers, the loved ones, the ombudsmen. It brings all of these people together to establish a discharge plan that ensures the safety of the resident. Most importantly, it would establish a definite location in which the resident will continue to receive care until the discharge is finalized. These issues did not move forward in the previous two sessions of the legislature, mostly in part in part to the COVID-19 mess that we had nationally and in our state.
Judy, I
We're
know that
asking you
I
now-
apologize. Can you hear me? I know you couldn't hear the bell, but it has been 2 minutes. Thank you so much, and we have your written testimony, and you will remain on WebEx for questions, right?
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
So on WebEx, we have Rachel Imthorn. Hope I didn't butcher your last name. Is Rachel available, Dusty? Rachel, if you can hear me, we just need you to unmute. Rachel, if you heard, you have 2 minutes, and I know you won't be able to hear the tone, so I will let you know when 2 minutes is up. Thank you.
Thank you. This bill is long overdue. My husband Charlie was illegally evicted from an assisted living facility that caused his death 9 days later because of transfer trauma, which Jamie told you about. There was no cause for discharge. He was guaranteed full care to end of life, so he would never have to move again, but that was not upheld. Regulations are not enforced. There was no cause, no doctor's notice, no advance notice. This happened all at once. They broke our contracts and violated regulations and put human life at risk. KDAD's investigated, but they did nothing. And the worst part is that the resident has absolutely nothing they can do. Residents of assisted living facilities in Kansas have no legal rights. So unwarranted eviction continues unabated year after year. It's a primary complaint received by the long-term care ombudsman. The state attorney general says nothing will change until we have better laws. Senate Bill 191 gives assisted living residents the legal rights, the legal protection they've never had. I urge your support of this bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, we have Dan Goodman. And is Dan on WebEx, Dusty? Very good. Dan, can you hear me?
I can. Can
Good.
you hear me?
You will have 2 minutes. Thank you so much for being with us.
All right. Thank you. I am Dan Goodman, Executive Director of Kansas Advocates for Better Care. KABC is a statewide non-for-profit organization whose mission is to improve the quality of long-term care for older Kansans, regardless of where they choose to live. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and the need to close a gap in the due process laws in Kansas, specifically a gap that exists for residents of assisted living facilities. I am here today to ask your support for Senate Bill 191, which would grant the right to appeal to assisted living residents who are involuntarily discharged from Kansas assisted living facilities. Assisted living and home plus facilities are for persons needing less care but still need help with activities of daily living. These homes do not provide 24-hour nursing care. Currently, there are no provisions for an independent or third-party entity to review this eviction at assisted living or homes plus, even though Kansas regulations, all adult care homes are otherwise the same. State regulations give residents 30 days to find a safe and appropriate place to live and requires a facility to provide the family the reasons for discharge and approve and doctor's notice. The Judicial Council met this summer, and as a result, they released a report in December that addressed this issue. And the addition to that, the Judicial Council recognized that there may be certain situations that require immediate action, and for those situations, it was recommended a process for emergency involuntary transfer or discharge appeal. Senate Bill 191 reflects the Judicial Council's recommendations, which provide a strong framework for appeals process and balances the residents' rights to due process with the health and safety residents of the facility staff. Again, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you on this, and we urge you to close the due process gap for people living in assisted living. We ask that you pass Senate Bill 191.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much. Committee, we are going to proceed with the opponents, and we just have 2 in the committee room. I'm going to give each of them 3 minutes. They won't get the equal time with the proponents, but let's start with Haley or Doyne. Is she in the committee room? Oh, she's on WebEx. Haley, thank you so much, and you will have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Haley Ordoyne. I am here on behalf of the Kansas Adult Care Executives. We represent administrators and operators of nursing facilities, assisted living, independent living, all of these myriad of services. We are the ones implementing this on a daily basis. As stated before with the ombudsman, this is nothing new. There are already regulations in place that we are abided by to follow. We do have a process in place. We do communicate to the families or the responsible party. We do have a physician involved, normally their primary care physician, to state that there is a change in needs. Upon admission, an assessment is done that determines their needs at that time and a contract agreement of what services can be provided. As a colleague of mine stated, this is essentially asking some of these homes, if you put it in context of like an emergency care, a stat care clinic, to provide open heart surgery. It's outside of the scope of practice, and the danger that you run into, yes, with dementia, you can have dangers to that individual. You can also have dangers if you ask them to stay in place at a level of care that they are not able to be provided in that setting. There's a reason we have different levels of settings for care. So we would just ask that that be taken into consideration. Again, we are not opposed to processes. We run our industry and our homes off of processes, but we ask for you to take into consideration not only the safety of that individual, but also other individuals that are in that home setting, that person with an involuntary discharge could be a danger to. So thank you for your time. I'm happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much. And now we'll ask for Rachel to come forward. Rachel Munger.
Good morning, Madam Chair. I am Rachel Monger with Leading Age Kansas. We're the faith-based nonprofit aging services association in the state. Thank you to Haley for clarifying about all the things we already have in place right now. And we do want to make sure it's clear that none of our objections are meant to discount any of the concerns you've heard today. There are issues around assisted living discharge and discharges in general that are pain points and need to be discussed and worked on, but this bill cannot be the solution. The point we can't seem to stress enough is that assisted livings are not nursing homes. They're also not residential landlords. Each assisted living decides what type and level of care they provide, established via contract, as Haley went over. They are not set up or staffed like a nursing home. They aren't even required to have a nurse on site. Overall, our objections to Senate Bill 191 revolve around the consequences of forcing an assisted living to retain a resident for whom they cannot properly care. As further outlined in our testimony, which is 5 pages and very dense, but hopefully you're able to at least skim through some of it, it does endanger the resident, other staff, and other residents of the facility, increases costs for all residents, and results in a much higher risk of lawsuits against the facility. We've also outlined in our testimony some of the concerns we have regarding specific administrative requirements in the bill. Some of those include, but are not limited to, holding state agencies to unrealistic timeframes they're unlikely to follow, with no way of enforcing or remedying that situation, and delaying even more the time that people are staying in the facilities we can't provide services to, requiring written approval from the Secretary of KDADS prior to an emergency discharge. And based on the testimony we've heard on the House version of this bill, the issue seems to be with a small number of possible bad actors. It's been specifically linked to dementia care as well. If that's something we need to talk about more, let's talk about possible targeted solutions, whether that's at the beginning with transparency and ethical marking, which we've talked about and offered to talk about in the past, as well as putting teeth into the existing regulations we already have. What we can support is this kind of broad and what we believe to be extreme legislation that does put people in danger and upends an entire sector in order to address a much narrower issue that we can really start to tackle. So we do believe this is bad policy. We do respectfully request that the committee vote no on Senate Bill 191.
Thank you, Rachel. Committee, may I ask questions of any of the conferees? I'm going to limit questions to about 8 minutes, about 3 minutes after. That will give us about 8 minutes. Okay, I'm sorry. Senator Stephan.
I interpreted that to mean I get 8 minutes of questions, but I won't take it. Thank you. Ms. Monger, what I heard through this, particularly from the proponents, is that they're not asking them to do anything they aren't already doing, that there is a contract. And if you have a contract, you have rights. I know we have an attorney testified. Tell me if I'm incorrect. And I also heard that KDAD did nothing on a complaint. So is the answer of failed government more government? Is this just the definition of death by 1,000 cuts? What's going on here? Help me understand.
Well, gosh, I think that, I'll just reiterate our position of saying that I don't think there's anyone in here that doesn't believe that discharges and moving to different levels of care and healthcare itself is not always a constant struggle and a constant discussion that needs to keep happening. And we are trying to be flexible to say, we know this is hard for families and it's hard for everyone involved. And we want to find targeted solutions, but instead we keep getting more extreme versions of this bill that seem to get broader and put more people in danger. And so what we're asking for is, another chance to look at some of these issues in a different way that are more targeted and really actually go after bad actors instead of what we tend to do, which is complicate and endanger and put everybody in this pot when we could be looking at solutions that are going after people who are in fact doing it wrong, which is a small number of people.
We're over bureaucratizing this, it sounds like to me.
That's what we believe, yes.
Rachel, while you're up there, thank you, Senator Stephan. Rachel, while you're up there, I have a quick question for you, and that is, we've talked about procedures. So, and you mentioned that in assisted living, there are certain things that you do not do or certain services you cannot provide compared to a nursing home. Is this clearly stated in the contract with the family for the individual?
If you are doing what you are supposed to under the regulations, then yes, it's called a negotiated service agreement. That's the official name you'll see in regulation. And that sets out what the assisted living is able to do for you and will do for you, including the cost of that, and also what they do not provide. That is all set out from the beginning. And I think, again, what we're talking about are a small number of bad actors. How can we figure out how to get to those people instead of upending a system that has worked very, very well for many decades and has provided a lower cost, lower care setting for a lot of people who really benefit from that?
Thank you. Any more questions for Rachel? Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Have the two sides attempted to come together? Because it seems to me I don't have necessarily the wherewithal to understand what the proper time frame is, and I would be much more comfortable with the two sides hashing this out before we dealt with this type situation in legislation. I'm just wondering how much negotiation has happened.
Well, I think what you heard referenced in Proponent's testimony was the Judicial Council and that report that came out. We were on that Judicial Council. I think the problem was provider advocates were greatly outnumbered on that. And so we did try to make our own suggestions. We did try to lodge our objections, but we were always way outvoted. And so the Judicial Council just went forward without our approval of pretty much anything in that report. And so I think that we really haven't been given a lot of opportunities to fairly come to the table and talk about that.
Madam Chair, I'd suggest we provide that opportunity before we proceed. That's just a suggestion from me. I'm not saying
Thank you,
how
Senator
we
Thompson.
go,
And I think we have time for a couple of other questions, and we have Senator O'Shea on WebEx. All right, we'll move to Senator Petty.
Oh, Senator Gossage.
Yes, okay,
Sorry,
Senator
I
O'Shea.
just asked my whole question on mute. Thank you. I'm like, what? Anyhow, Senator Gossage, you asked one of my questions. My other question is probably for Rachel. What kind of position does this put the nurses in that are currently caring for someone that's getting beyond the scope of what they're able to care for in assisted living? Thank you.
I don't want to talk way outside my area of expertise, but I do think you, in answering that question, you go down kind of two different paths. One is the I am a healthcare provider, a nurse or a nurse aide, and I have that moral obligation. This is why I'm here, is to take care of people. And what happens when I know I cannot, and now I'm being asked to just leave this person? I think I'm not going to go down this legal right, but I think that there are, obligations as a nurse as well under your license of how you take care of people and what your obligations are there as well. And I don't know, again, it could put a nurse in a bad situation as far as.
Thank you. And Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is a question for Camille Russell. Camille, thanks for being here. In your testimony, you talked about there's nothing new So why a bill?
So there's nothing new in the part where they have to provide the notice, how they provide the notice, the information and the notice. The appeal would allow for us to really bring to light what the advocates have been telling you all for a long time, is that they're not following those rules that give them the opportunity to appeal, quite frankly, false information. And a great example of what we honestly, we just heard is that a nurse is going to be put at risk. And I think we have a doctor or two maybe in the room, and it's like, they know they can't force care on someone. And they can't in these facilities either. The nurse can't force care. In fact, the contract that they sign says that if they know that there's a functional screening and there needs something else, and you hear a lot of times about insulin, well, that person has a choice then. They can get a different provider to provide their insulin, which, by the way, the home they're in is supposed to help them reach out to people to contract to do that if they can't do that. Or they can choose not to take their insulin, just like you or I would be able to. It says right here that they just provide the information to the person. It's in their negotiated service agreement we're talking about, by the way. It says you identify the negative outcomes with the person. If that person chooses, I would rather not take my regulation.
Just to follow up, you have in your testimony an amendment.
I do, with regard to location, that was the main one, was that it came out that said that if they had to put in the criteria, one of the things is that they put a specific location, and that it says then if known. And that if known, we asked for it to be removed because the if known really would only happen in just a really rare emergency situation. And I have given an example before of, maybe somebody did intentionally in an assisted living decide to commit a crime, intentionally, knowingly, and were arrested. They wouldn't know where that person was going in an emergency, which jail they were going to. But to do a proper discharge, you would have to know where you would go, you were sending the person to. You would have met with that person, you would have talked to that person, make sure that place was an appropriate place for them to be to do a safe discharge.
Camille and Senator Petty, thank you so much for your time. This closes the hearing on Senate Bill 191, and we will open the hearing on Senate Bill 112, and Jenna will give us a brief bill and summary.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senate Bill 112 is a little bit shorter than Senate Bill 191, and this would expand, or not expand the scope of practice, it would change the statutory requirements for the scope of practice for registered nurse anesthetists, which are commonly referred to as CRNAs, and this would strike the existing, this bill would amend KSA 651158, and it would strike the CRNA practice authority. There's currently in statute an itemized list, and instead of permitting a specific list of duties that a CRNA could perform, the bill would instead, on lines 25 through 27, allow a CRNA to practice to the full extent of his or her education and qualifications. And subsection B would allow a CRNA to prescribe, procure, or administer prescription drugs consistent with their education and qualifications. I'll be happy to answer any questions about the bill.
Questions for Jenna? Right, seeing none, we will start with our proponents. You will each have 2 minutes, and we'll start with Eric Stafford. Is Eric in the room? We'll go on to Kelly Gordon.
Good morning, Madam Chair and honorable committee members. I'm Kelly Gordon. I'm here as a proponent for Senate Bill 112. I'm also president-elect of the Kansas Association of Nurse Anesthetists. I live and reside in Olathe, Kansas. I've been a practicing CRNA for 23 years now. I currently own and operate Ethos Anesthesia Services. We provide anesthesia providers across the state of Kansas, nationwide, and in the U.S. Virgin Islands. In the 23 years that I've been a practicing CRNA in the state of Kansas, I have not been able to operate at the full extent of my educational training at Truman Medical Center School of Nurse Anesthesia. One of the issues that we have is when I work independently at an ambulatory surgery center or in a dental office, I am procuring and administering medications that I'm having to obtain through another professional's DEA license. Given the fact that we are the ones administering the medications, it only makes sense that we are the ones to be ultimately responsible for those medications. And given this, it only makes sense that CRNAs are able to also obtain a DEA license if their practice has a need to do so. The other issue that is problematic is that when I operate as an independent provider, I cannot do so alongside a podiatrist. When I work with a podiatrist, I have to hire in a physician to complete a history and physical. If I'm to put any one of you to sleep, I do a complete history and physical. I discuss with you your anesthesia that you have previously had, any complications that you had with such. I listen to your heart and lungs. I discuss with you any cardiac, lung, liver, kidney, current medications that you're on, any medications that you take intermittently. And then we provide a safe and effective anesthetic plan for you that we discuss with not only you, but your surgeon. We then proceed with the anesthesia, take care of you, wake you up, take you to the PACU, and discharge you when it is safe to do so. Given the fact that we are completing a thorough history and physical prior to any anesthetic that we give any patient in the state of Kansas, that only makes sense that we are also able to utilize that history and physical. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And next we will have Jeff Glasgow. Did I say that right? Is it Glasgow or Glasgow?
I've heard everything.
Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm a CRNA providing proponent testimony for Senate Bill 112. I provided written testimony for you, so my comments will be brief today. I provide anesthesia services to dental offices all across Kansas, from Kansas City all the way to Liberal, and it's been one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. To put a new smile on a young child who's not smiled for a long time due to dental decay or take away the abscessed teeth when only an ER physician can only prescribe penicillin when the facial swelling occurs at the dead of night, gives me the compassion for my long journeys. I put children to sleep because their teeth would frighten you. I quit taking the pictures because I've seen the worst and I've smelled the worst decay ever. This is a common scene when I work with Kansas Medicaid children. In fact, I've seen over 17,000 new patients under the age of 8 that are on Medicaid in the last 15 years. Because of my work and my partner and associates, we have saved the state of Kansas $34 million in hospital and surgical center fees. $34 million. That amount doesn't even include the special needs adults. We continue to be a resource for the state of Kansas, but I'm needing your help. I'm needing a DEA with the Senate Bill 112. In the last 5 years, I've spent over $350,000 in drugs, and at least half of them I have to throw away because they become expired or recalled. I have to work with over 5 different pharmacies because on any given day, we have drug shortages. Yes, we have generic anesthesia drug shortages. It does not make sense to have to work with over 50 dentist DEAs to order drugs through their DEA when the dentist has no understanding of principles, mode of action, termination, or pharmacodynamics, pharmacokinetics, contraindications, or side effects of these drugs. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you for your testimony. And Scott Call, are you in the room? Oh, yes, in person. Did I say that right? Is it Call?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Welcome to committee.
Thank you, everyone, for allowing me to speak today. My name is Scott Call. I'm a CRNA provider in Kansas. I focus my practice in rural hospital setting. I work full-time in pain management, which is a subspecialty of nurse anesthesia practice. I did my training here at Stormont Vale through Texas Wesleyan University. I worked here for the first year, and then I focused on rural practice. So I'm in support of this bill today because of the significance it will have on my practice in terms of the lowering of costs, improvement of access, and also improvement of workflow. There's 3 main issues I want to highlight on that directly affect my practice. The first is direct referrals. Kelly touched on the fact that we can't do things for a podiatrist in the surgical environment, but in the pain environment, I can't take orders from anybody but a physician. So when it comes down to getting a referral from an APRN who's practicing or even a chiropractor who I frequently take orders from, I have to find a physician to give me an actual order so I can see them and manage their care for the pain management aspect. The second issue I wanted to talk about was prescriptive authority. In my setting, in the last 2 weeks, I've worked 5 days in pain at the clinic here in Kansas. In in those days, I've had 7 patients who I've had to talk to 5 different providers for, just to simply get some steroids or a simple medication to help try to augment their pain. So instead of wasting all this time making multiple phone calls to either APRNs or physicians, this would give me the ability to do this on my own, and so to alleviate that issue. That's the end of my time. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you for your testimony. And next we have Elizabeth Patton from Americans for Prosperity on WebEx. Elizabeth, are you with us? She's not on yet. All right, let's move on to the opponent. You will have 3 minutes for Rochelle Colombo.
Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I am Rochelle Colombo. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas Medical Society. And as you know, we oppose Senate Bill 112. We've been very familiar in this committee talking about the practice of medicine by non-physicians. It is the principle of the Kansas Medical Society that training and education matter and that they serve the purpose of protecting patients. Prescribing is part of the practice of medicine, and for that reason, we oppose Senate Bill 112. When the proponents of this bill when we became aware of it, which was just when it was introduced this year, we did reach out and ask if we could, they reached out and asked if they could sit down and tell us why they felt this bill was necessary. I think it's important for you all to know that in the history of the Practice Act, the APRN Act, which was changed last year, is separate from the CRNA Practice Act. And it's been negotiated a couple of times, the most recent of which was in 2010. The Medical Society has always worked with the CRNAs to make sure that their Practice Act reflects what is best for Kansas patients, balances the needs of access and patient protection. And that was recently negotiated in 2010 with language that, as was explained by the reviser, specified which duties a CRNA could perform as a part of an interdependent team. So as you've heard, CRNAs work in a variety of settings, some of them somewhat independently. They work in rural settings and in hospitals, but there are limitations currently on what a CRNA can do, and one of the things they cannot do is prescribe independently. But when we sat down with them, they said, well, last year in 2280, other categories of APRNs were given the ability to prescribe independently, and we would like to have that same privilege. They have in every year that this bill or these proposals have come before the legislature. Until now, they've always asked to be exempted from that legislation because they have their own Practice Act, which was, again, pretty carefully negotiated. So we were a bit surprised by that. I do understand why they would like to be treated the same as the other categories of APRNs. But you'll see in my written testimony that we suggest that the best way to do that would be with differing language. And I'm actually, I can give it to you all now, or we can visit it later. But we've, in just the last day or two, we've been trying to understand more about the intent of what this bill would allow, because they carefully say that it would allow for the independent practice of certified nurse, and I just already said it wrong, but CRNAs. And we want to clarify that that would not include the performance of invasive procedures or surgical procedures. And so even for the purposes of administering a drug, because there are procedures and surgical procedures which involve placing a device inside the body that a surgeon needs to perform. And so we wanted to clarify that language. They have been very open to working with us on that, which we appreciate. They've communicated to me that it is not their intent to perform surgery or invasive procedures, and it is not our intent with this language to limit them from prescribing. Though we disagree with it, this would not affect that. So I want to be clear that we would like to have the opportunity to agree to that language and bring forward something that we believe would be better a policy, though we do oppose it. I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, committee. We have about 6 minutes for questions. Senator Stephan.
Thank you. And this may be directed more at the proponents. I thought it very interesting that the approach was more emotional than it was scientific. To me, this is when you change the degree of practice, the level of practice, you do that based on data showing that it's safe to do so. There are a zillion cases being done across the country every day, and there is no reason these studies aren't done, haven't been done, can't be done. So the two things I would need from you all is the data showing that there isn't a difference between anesthesiologists and nurse anesthetists. And secondly, the wild card that's just come into our culture is this social emotional learning. If you can show that social emotional learning is not going on in your training facilities, that will be a major step ahead of the medical doctors. So I couldn't possibly render a reasonable opinion on this bill until those two issues are met. Thank you.
Senator Petty?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a question for Kelly Gordon. Hi, Kelly. Thanks for being here. And I'm going to speak to the bill specifically, but we just heard from Rochelle Colombo. And so are you aware of this potential compromise?
Yes. Yes. And actually, that has just been within the last day or two that we've been in discussion.
And so my follow-up question would be, does that, would that meet the specific needs?
Can I defer that to our lobbyist, Mitch?
You sure can.
Thank you.
So we've been in those conversations the last few days, so that may be why some of the members of the committee are not specifically aware of the most recent conversations. So apologies on that part, but yes, the devil's in the details of what is specifically written, and that's what we'll be working with Medical Society to make sure that our understanding on both sides is met with the language that's being written.
Thanks, Mitch. That seems to sound like it can move in the right direction.
And I would just say, as chair, that I would like to hear from both of the parties before we work this bill and if we work this bill. Okay? Committee, any other questions? This closes the hearing on Senate Bill 112, and committee, we are adjourned.